Well, we're ready to get started with our next session. We hope all of you who just attended our keynote session discussing how AI and machine learning will play an essential part in the future of RBQM enjoyed all of the thoughts from our panelists. Thank you for joining our second session of the day, RBQM Best Practices Defined by Leading Industry Working Groups. My name is Steve Young. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for CluePoints, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. I'm honored to introduce you to our speakers for today's discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Linda Sullivan, the Senior Advisor for Metrics and Performance Management at WCG. Here, she serves as a subject matter expert to the WCG Clinical Service Organization, WCG Avoca Quality Consortium work groups, regulatory authorities, and industry groups. She hosts the Clinical Trial Optimization podcast show that explores current topics such as quality by design, risk-based quality management, vendor oversight, and data analytics. She founded and served as executive director of the Metrics Champion Consortium, an industry consortium dedicated to bringing clinical research sponsors, vendors, and investigative sites together to collaboratively develop standardized performance metrics that help organizations oversee and manage studies, identify areas in need of improvement, and assess process improvement activities. The consortium was acquired by WCG and merged with the WCG Avoca Quality Consortium in 2021. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you, Steve.
And next, I'd like to introduce Nicole Stansbury, the former Vice President of Global Clinical Trial Management at Syneos, and now consulting for the biotech and pharma industry. Nicole is a bold and passionate leader experienced in guiding clinical operations teams through transformative change by harnessing technology and operational efficiencies. Nicole has 30 years of experience in the industry, beginning as a study coordinator in a multi-therapeutic site, followed by 25 years at large global CROs, where she spent several years as a clinical research associate and project manager before moving into leadership roles. Additionally, Nicole has consulted with biotech companies on the ICH E6R2 compliance, conducted risk management training, performed a detailed assessment of EDC, CTMS, RBM, and eTMF technologies for a small CRO, and completed a risk management and centralized monitoring process assessment for a large pharmaceutical company. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you.
Okay, before we get the conversation started, I wanted to take a moment to walk through the console for our session today to help you better navigate what you see on your screen for a great experience throughout this session and for the remaining sessions for RBQM Live 2022. On your screen, you will see a window for slides, a window for video, some more highlights on our speakers, and a Q&A box where we encourage all of you to submit questions throughout this session that will take some time to answer at the end. All of these windows can be adjusted to your preferred viewing size for an optimal event experience. You will also see a Take Action tool that will remind you to click on at the end of this session to take you directly to our next session of today's event. Now let's get started. Linda and then Nicole will each take time to share some very interesting information from the industry consortiums that they work with. Following that, we'll further discuss their perspectives on RBQM emerging trends, and we'll plan to leave some time towards the end for fielding your questions. So please enter any questions you have along the way. We'll be happy to field them, either during the session or directly after. Linda, can I hand it over to you now?
Thank you, Steve. I want to thank CluePoints for having this session again. We had one last year at the event, and it was such a great opportunity to learn about what is going on in the industry and the various industry groups. So I'm pleased to be back and give you an update on what's been going on in the consortium that I'm involved with. And we'll go to the next slide. So as Steve mentioned in my introduction, when I was here a year ago in May, I was representing the Metrics Champion Consortium. And since then, we've had an extremely busy year. The big news, which most probably know, are that the Avoca Quality Consortium and the Metrics Champion Consortium, both of whom are part of the WCG organization, were merged into a single, I call it the super consortium. And we're now going under the heading of the Avoca Quality Consortium. So there's been quite a bit of growth. As you can well imagine, quite a lot of activity. The consortium has more than 200 organizations that are part of it. For those of you that aren't familiar with either of the MCC or the AQC, this is one of these multi-stakeholder consortium in the industry where companies join, and then people that work for those companies can participate in the events that we have online. So we have sponsors of all sizes, CROs, clinical service providers, sites, and other organizations that are involved with helping you run clinical trial execution. And it's important to understand that much of the perspective and what I'll be sharing during our discussion today really comes from that multi-stakeholder environment. So it sometimes represents a slightly different view than what some of the other consortia might represent. So next slide. There really are two major things that I wanted to kind of alert you to in terms of really important work, I think, that has come out of the consortium over the last 12 months. The first is, I think I mentioned a year ago at the event that we had a QTL working group. This was a sub-team of members that had experience with utilizing QTLs. In fact, we had 20 individuals representing 16 organizations, including sponsors, CROs, and some of the RBQM vendors that were members. And they were essentially sort of taking what the current state of knowledge was about using QTLs, implementing QTLs, defining them, et cetera, and kind of taking it to the next level. And we have published the work of that working group. It has recently been made available in Applied Clinical Trials. It was quite a long, lengthy document, so it's been separated into 3 separate articles that are posted as viewed up here. It's very easy to find. You can go to Applied Clinical Trials online, and if you put QTL in the search box, it comes right up. So just to give you a sense of what's included in those articles, if you haven't seen them, the first was really sort of the introduction and the foundation. So some background about QTLs and some of the challenges organizations are facing implementing them. And then I think most importantly, rather than treating QTLs as something completely different from KRIs, it really started to set the foundation of sort of how do QTLs and KRIs work together, and what are they? And so things like first establishing that KRIs are being used by organizations at a study level, and that in fact QTLs are sort of a special category of study level KRIs. So that's, I think, some of the learning that's been contributed. The second one is looking at how are organizations defining QTLs. So trying to get into a little bit more detail around sort of how does that work, and then some use cases of what are organizations typically using, what are they not typically using, but in fact they're using KRIs instead. And then part 3 is where we really put on our measurement hat, because this is where we have the expertise within our consortium, and really talked about sort of how to normalize metrics, how to use metrics together, and there's a really nice example in the appendix. So encourage you to take advantage of the fact that while most of what we do in the AQC is kept to member only, this was a rare event where people felt very strongly they wanted this to be shared with the public, and so you can see it on Applied Clinical Trials. Next slide, Steve. The second thing that I had announced a year ago, when we've made tremendous progress, is putting together a consensus-based centralized and site monitoring process metric toolkit. So we recognized in 2019 that the process of monitoring had really gone through quite an evolution. We had a centralized monitoring guidance document, which was really talking about how organizations were organizing around this new concept of centralized monitoring and who's doing what, where, how, when, et cetera. And then we stepped back and we said, you know, we have metric toolkits that align with processes, and realized that what we had in our existing metric toolkit at the time for monitoring was very much focused on the traditional site monitoring process. So we went through the metric development framework, where we really spent time on what does this new process look like? How do we define success of this process? And what are the questions we have along the way or at the end about whether we're on track to achieve that success or whether we have achieved it? Those are the questions we then turn around and sort of say, well, what are we going to measure that's going to help you answer the question? That's sort of the framework that we use. And so we've actually spent the last year and a half going through the process of developing these metrics. We've had more than 300 people from over 60 organizations be part of these discussions. We started very late in 2019, and I'm very pleased to say, go to the next slide, Steve.
Yep.
That we released a part of the toolkit in July of 2021, and the final component will be wrapped up with a release of version 2.0 in a few weeks. And so this is quite a comprehensive set of metrics. It includes implementation support videos. There are 4 different process maps, so there's an overall one, and then there's some of various components. There's a total of 25 metrics that were defined. Some of them are across studies at that portfolio level, others are study level. Every metric has a purpose or rationale. There's green, amber, red targets, and some have been selected to be also used as key risk indicators. And finally, we have metric selection tools, so people can go in and pick out the questions they're wanting to answer or the issues they're encountering, and see which metrics in the set make sense for them there. So, as you can see, been a very busy year for us, and we're very pleased to kind of wrap up some major components of work with really important deliverables, we think. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Linda. That's fantastic overview and summary, and a lot of productive progress there within the consortium, WCG Avoca. Of course, I'm a big advocate myself, as you know. I've been working with you guys over the years as well, and it's been really an honor to collaborate on various projects, especially around RBQM. Nicole, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. So today I'm representing ACRO, the Association of Clinical Research Organizations. ACRO is a trade organization that represents the world's leading clinical research organizations and technology organizations. ACRO's 15 member companies manage or support the majority of FDA-regulated clinical investigations worldwide. As I said, I've been a part of the RBQM working group since its inception in 2015. During that time, ACRO set up this committee so that we would be focused on advancing the adoption of RBQM through the industry. As part of this working group, we discuss challenges and barriers to implementation. We advocate with regulators for adoption of guidance and things like that, as well as conducting landscape surveys that foster thought leadership. And we do have regular meetings with the regulators. In fact, we've got a listening session coming up next week. So looking forward to that. So I wanted to share today with you the surveys that we have conducted. These surveys have been conducted over the course of the last 3 years. And one thing that makes our surveys different from other surveys or data that you'll see reported on RBM adoption is the fact that we're not looking at the number of companies or what companies components of RBM are being adopted, but we're actually took individual studies and looked at the different RBM components that were included on all these studies. So you can see in 2019, this involved over 6,000 studies. In 2020, it was just about 6,000 studies, and then just about 5,000 studies in our most recent 2021 landscape survey. The data set is made up of outsourced clinical trials only. So this does not include any information from sponsor companies that may be implementing RBM on their studies. These are ones that have been outsourced to CROs for the most part. Sponsors do maintain oversight of some of the components. So when we see some of the data, you'll see not quite 100% of our studies with risk assessments, for example. And that could be because sponsors are retaining that, that component of RBM themselves. QTLs is another example. I know Linda mentioned QTLs, and it's still an area that we need adoption, but if sponsors are holding the accountability for QTLs, we're not going to show that in our survey, for example. So there may be a slight underestimate of some of the RBM and RBQM components, but for the most part, we feel like this is a really good view of adoption over time in the industry. And each year we are improving our ability to track and report on these capabilities. So excited to see this year over year. You can see how we've, one of the biggest things that we looked at was in 2019, we said, how many studies have at least one component of RBM? And back in 2019, that was about 53%. Now you can see almost 88% of studies have at least one element of RBQM. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that when we looked at these studies, a majority of them were phase 1, phase 2 studies. And they are, the study size for the majority of these were small, so they had less than 300 patients making up the data. You can see that over the years, we have seen great progress in improving our adoption of the initial risk assessment. QTLs, central monitoring, and offsite or remote monitoring have seen some great adoption over time. And these are ongoing studies. If you look at the next slide, you'll see the new study starts. And you can see as we were initiating new studies, continued adoption across some of the key elements, such as initial risk assessment. But there's still some areas in particular that we would expect to improve. And in particular, we have been focused on greater adoption of central monitoring with a corresponding reduction in SDR and SDV. I think those are probably the two areas where we feel like the industry has the most opportunity to adopt some of these components for improved quality, efficiency, and effectiveness of monitoring. Next slide. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on those slides. I think yesterday, a couple of the presenters showed different components of those slides, and I think it's much better to review the entire thing with the QR codes linked to the papers. But our risk assessments now are on almost every study, and that should remain as a core driver for appropriate implementation of RBQM. As I mentioned, reduced SDR and SDV still have the potential to increase, especially if we look at new study starts year over year. And strong adoption of central monitoring is going to be important as we look at driving that reduction in SDR and SDV. And finally, I think it's important to note in our analysis that no one-size-fits-all approach is out there. I think a modular component approach to RBQM that allows flexibility depending on the risks, the size of the study, the number of sites, number of patients, number of data sources, those kinds of things are still going to be important as you make decisions around the different RBQM components to apply. And that is it for me, I believe.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nicole. That's really fascinating information. It's really fantastic. I was just curious before we get into the panel discussion, the results on let me see. The slide with new studies, it appears in general that there's only a very modest increase in some of these RBQM components, but for the ongoing studies graph, it looked like it was much more dramatic increase. Any thoughts on that observation?
We've looked at a couple of different things. I mean, I think for a lot of the ongoing studies, they had that push to move in that direction during COVID, the pandemic. And so we saw a lot greater adoption during that point of time, I think simply due to the fact that we could not monitor in another way.
Right.
But we aren't seeing that stick as much in these new study starts. We're seeing people revert back a little bit to some of those older, more comfortable routines. And we want to continue to make sure that we maintain that momentum that we developed with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yep, no, makes sense. No, thank you for that. So let's move now to our panel discussion. I have a first question or topic I'd like each of you to comment on. First, what are you seeing as the RBQM topics that have been of greatest interest for your working groups and the people in your working groups over the past year? And I guess along with that, maybe you could comment on, do you see the focus shifting at all from previous years, and what effect has the pandemic maybe had on that focus? Linda, can I start with you on that one?
So let me just sort of start off by reminding you who's part of our consortium. And I think the areas of greatest interest for small biopharma may be slightly different from the large biopharma. So, we try to have topics that are going to resonate with everybody. Certainly one of the areas that we've spent time on this year is regulatory updates. There's, we spent some time with an ICHE 8R1 sort of change management kit, sort of what does it mean? And so you start to bring in some of the things like quality culture, critical thinking, et cetera. And, then we had MHRA put out some new guidance on risk-based approaches, and EU-CTR came in, and we've got, E6R3 draft floating around. So, certainly one of the roles that a consortium plays is sort of, trying to figure out what does this all mean and sort of learning from each other. The second is, obviously, we've spent a lot of time with QTLs, as you can see, and also really thinking about some of the operational side of this new monitoring sort of paradigm. But beyond that, we still are seeing interest in sort of, critical thinking, quality culture, process thinking when you're identifying risks and KRIs. So some of those real sort of practical operational things. One of the areas we haven't spent as much time on, but we're going to be revisiting actually later this month. We have a group that meets on a monthly basis and sort of going back to revisit site KRIs. As a result of COVID, has there been new KRIs that people are typically looking at, et cetera? So it's sort of an evolving area for us, but certainly all of the regulatory changes and updates are of great interest to the conversations we're having.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Linda. Nicole, your thoughts?
Yeah, from an ACRO perspective, we've been talking about things like, when do we make the switch from RBQM focused on monitoring to RBQM focused on just overall management components of the trial, not just even the clinical components of the trial, but RBQM management of all of our pieces. So we've talked about, at what point do we expand there? Really talking about, needing to see case studies and present case studies on actual value. That value proposition has been talked about for a long time, but what was the result of that? We're starting to move in this direction. We've got a lot of great experience coming out of COVID with true application. Let's now talk about what the results of that were. What did we see, and what can we do to continue to provide those proof points to increase adoption as we move forward? So those are some of the things that we've been talking about in how to continue that greater adoption.
No, that's really interesting. So measuring the value and the success of RBQM implementation.
I know it was interesting, Steve, yesterday in one of the sessions. I know Jackie Goff from Syneos spoke about, do we need, is it important to have, metrics to show evidence of that it works? And I agree with her. I don't know that we need metrics to show evidence that it works, because she's right. It's very hard to prove a negative. But what we have to do is show that what we're doing is creating that value proposition that we've put forth. Not just how many studies are doing it, but what was the outcome. And at ACRO, we're really wanting to collaborate more with regulators on getting some of those proof points, looking at interrogating some of the data on inspection findings and other things to see, are there any issues with, in the absence of evidence of the positive, is there anything to show that this has caused any damage to our studies moving in this direction? And we all know and feel it has not, but we've got to get to that point where we're able to communicate that, I think, to continue to increase adoption at the rates we really want to see.
Excellent. And I think you answered one of the questions I was thinking of as you brought that up, and what might be some of the key measures of success, or of the success or not, and looking at inspection findings sounds like an important area to look at. Of course, I guess one of the challenges there is that takes time, right? It takes years for studies to complete and actually be able to start observing those things. I'm wondering, and this is really for either one of you, are there other more prospective types of measures that your groups are thinking of that or might be looking to measure in terms of, because I know from some of the discussions I've been in over the years, it's and as Jackie mentioned, I think you pointed out yesterday, it's in general, it's a challenge. How do you measure improved quality, for instance? Right.
I think there are some things that we can look at measuring in real time right now. So one of the things Jackie also mentioned yesterday was using central monitoring within 72 hours of data being entered. And so instead of looking at maybe trying to measure what we missed or what those inspection findings are that happen way later on, to your point, what if we looked at things like, how much more quickly are we identifying protocol deviations today compared to 10 years ago? Right. How much more quickly are we identifying critical to quality issues through that central review? Are we preventing more issues? Some of those kinds of things, I think, are good examples of showing just how much more quickly we can get to and review data using some of these methodologies than we were in the past, waiting at a 6 to 8 week interval to go assess, the data in the field.
Yeah, makes
so
sense.
I think one of the challenges here is that in addition to putting new approaches in, we've also shifted to looking at quality that matters, critical to quality area. And so we don't actually even have a before to compare what we're looking at now, because there's been so much change that's gone on. But, we certainly hear the question all the time, what do the regulators think about this, and what does good look like? That is the question that I get all the time. What does good look like? Because we've sort of shifted both the definition of good as well as what are, the regulators, have they made that shift? When they come in and do those inspections, are they still using the old playbook, or have they really kind of advanced? And I give kudos to the regulators. I think they've done a lot of work in the last few years to really be more open, more transparent. There's a lot more opportunity to interact with them. And I will say that, Steve, you're right. One of the challenges is everybody's run around and they've implemented some of these new approaches, and everybody's waiting to see what happens when some of these studies get submitted for marketing approval. I was very pleased in June of this year at the DIA annual meeting. Several of the MHRA inspectors shared some of the kind of common RBQM related issues and findings. And, most of us in the room were about jumping out of our chair. I mean, we finally were starting to see what were they looking at, what does good look like? And when you coupled that together with the MHRA guidance that came out earlier this year, you could almost directly connect some of their findings to, paragraphs in that guidance. So I think we're getting a lot of good signals, and that continued message that, it's dependent on the study, but we're slowly through examples starting to figure out what does good look like.
Yeah.
Linda, I think you've got a really good point when you said that, we don't even have the baseline to go back and compare against. And if it made me think of Ken Getz's presentation in the keynote yesterday, because you're right. I mean, how we collect data today compared to 10 years ago is so different. We've got so many different sources of data, and the volume of data is so much greater. So even if we were comparing how 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we were collecting data in, much smaller amounts of data, and if we were looking at how long it took us to find issues within that, we are, he said, what, 3.5 million data points or something like that now? You can't, we have to start to adopt some of these risk-based approaches, because there's absolutely no scalable way to proceed in the ways that we were reviewing and monitoring data previously, just due to that vast increase in the volume of data and data sources.
Yeah, I think well said. I think it's a great observation, and indeed, it's we don't have apples to apples comparison between the past and today as we're implementing RBQM. I guess getting back to what we were saying though about inspection findings and submissions, really, I guess is the ultimate aggregate or at a high level measure of success, right? Are we getting a lot of important inspection findings compared to the past or not? And are we getting drugs moved to to the marketplace and to patients in an efficient, effective manner? And I guess you could think about measuring things like time to market approval and things like that, but sort of macro indicators. Of course, the challenge with those, I guess, is that there will always be the question: how much of any progress we see there can we attribute to RBQM, and how much can we attribute to other
advances,
other initiatives?
Yeah.
In fact. Yeah. Next question. What are the biggest challenges that you and your working groups and the people in them are seeing with respect to successful RBQM implementation? What kind of hurdles are you seeing? Are there certain topics for which it's been difficult to achieve industry-wide consensus? Your thoughts, Nicole, on that?
I think really two areas that I think are some of the biggest challenges today. And I feel like these are the same ones we've talked about for the last couple of years. Number one is access to data. So we all say, you know, we've got all these great technologies and tools, but we just don't have still access to great data and in real time. So just as an example, in central monitoring, we are still seeing vendor data coming in, you know, monthly or quarterly. And that is not timely enough for us to do our reviews to keep up on, you know, real-time review of that patient safety, efficacy concerns in the data, compliance with protocol, all of those kinds of things. So I think as an industry, we need to do better with, you know, making sure that our vendors understand the expectations needed to access to that data in real time. We need to make sure that we have an efficient way of getting that data in real time that is secure, but also not costly. We'll see, you know, where if we ask for data instead of monthly having, you know, can we have an every 24-hour API or something? And it's like, oh, you know, we don't have that set up, where it's going to cost $1 bazillion more dollars. And we've got to get more efficient in that. Like, we have to think that's the expectation. That should be the baseline. And so we've got to get as an industry to a point where we're thinking that way and planning that way ahead of time. And then I think the other key component is really getting unattached to the SDV metric. I think people are still focused on SDV as a metric, and somehow over the years that has become a surrogate for quality. And it's not a quality metric at all. It could loosely be considered a productivity metric, but even then, it just shows you check the box. It doesn't show that you actually did a thorough review using critical thinking and all those other things. So, you know, I think those are probably the two biggest challenges. If we can, you know, get past those in some way, I think we make huge advances in the RBQM space.
No, thank you. Really, I think those are great points. That's fantastic, and I'm sure, you know, many of us have dealt with the difficulty sometimes of accessing source data systems, and it is such a critical part of it, right? Because I mean, especially with the during study progress oversight, the centralized monitoring components. Key to success is not just detecting problems or risks, it's detecting them proactively so that you can intervene before. So delays are just completely counter to what we're trying to achieve. So I think that's a fantastic point. Linda, how about you?
Well, I agree with the points that Nicole raised, and just wanted to add a couple more. So first of all, I think the conversation we had before, which was what do the regulators think good looks like, is a major challenge for many organizations. They're not convinced that it's okay, right? So, you know, I think we're going to make some headway there. And I also think there's sort of a widening gap between those who were early adopters and who were ready to hit the ground running when the pandemic hit than those who didn't. You know, that the laggards, we can see from your survey data, you know, they're starting to come forward, and perhaps we've accelerated the implementation, but there are still some that are really struggling. And so part of what you see is, as you said, Nicole, you know, they don't even have the right contracts and agreements in place to get access to that data, et cetera. So, the good news is they can take advantage of the fact that the early adopters have paved the way, but I think there's still a lot of concern, and I also think it's sort of a change management, sort of human nature issue, which is those that are in charge of a lot of, oversight at very, high levels of management, they're used to managing studies in a certain way. And being comfortable that, well, it worked for me 30 years ago, why should I do it any differently? Is trying to get through that where, as you said, the case examples, the regulators say it's okay, et cetera. And I think this is really one of the roles that consortia can play in the industry, which is kind of allowing a place where you can come and ask questions, you can share challenges, you can share successes as a way of helping to support the industry getting through the change.
Yeah, no, makes a lot of sense. Great points on that. I have a couple more questions. Want to ask you both. The next one is, what are some of the key developments or progress that you've observed in RBQM best practices? Certainly over the last year or over the last couple of years. Linda, can you start with that one?
Well, I think that having E8R1 more closely tied to E6, as we get towards, we're still in a draft for R3, but really sort of tying those pieces together are really important. We've been trying to do it behind the scenes, but just getting that regulatory nod that yes, QBD and RBQM go hand in hand, right? They're not separate things and separate regulations that are done in separate parts of an organization. I think that's going to really help accelerate what we're doing and integrate things that I think were happening as little pilots within different parts of organizations and kind of start to bring those pieces together. We also have seen what you mentioned earlier, Nicole, which is the application of risk-based management approaches to auditing, to TMF review, et cetera. So I think the concept of risk management and risk has really finally taken hold, and they're applying it in lots of different areas. It's not this uncertain thing. And that there's a lot of progress, I think, being made with, machine learning, AI, NLP, that are going to help sort of give us more access to data that's going to help us be able to really apply some of the do risk assessment and really track what's going on.
From my perspective, I think that, one of the key developments is that I feel like we've sort of accepted the fact that this RBQM is here. So we're no longer convincing people of what it is or, what needs to happen. The conceptual piece, I think, is there, and it's solid for the most part, I think, within the industry across functions, data management, clinical, quality. I think everyone is starting to feel more comfortable with those concepts. And so the awareness is out there. Where I think we can see, more development in that area is sort of moving towards the actual processes, the mechanisms, the improving the way we were doing things. So, there may be a lot of companies out there, for example, that were doing a risk assessment, and they were doing a risk assessment and following the outline from a very basic fundamental standpoint. And I feel like over the last few years, we've really seen that linkage between, okay, now I've done the risk assessment, I'm actually fine-tuning that risk assessment to a point that is now linking it with my KRIs or my QTLs or how I look at data or the monitoring in the field. Like, I'm seeing more connection between the components of an RBQM solution than what we have seen historically, where, they were each kind of siloed. I think in the last 5 years, I would say we're not there yet. They can still be a little clunky, but at least they are interconnected, which they were not historically. We were taking each component and kind of having it be its own silo. And I'm really seeing some good cross collaboration functionally within organizations to tie that in a much tighter execution of RBQM.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation and a great point. And it's I guess, similar to what Linda was mentioning about connecting QBD and RBQM as well. Like they were probably siloed initiatives that were happening in different parts of the organization previously. And now with the help of the ICH updates, and I think R3 is helping in terms of connecting QBD principles with RBQM, right? Which are not different. And I couldn't agree more, Nicole. I've certainly seen the same thing where in the past it was, oh, you do the risk assessment over here, and that was disconnected from centralized monitoring and you know, and other parts of study conduct. Sort of, and I guess, like, would you say box checking mentality to begin with, just, you know, rotely following what people were telling you was the components of the process, but now the light bulbs are going off. People are understanding.
Exactly.
Well, and I'll add, I mean, those are some of the observations that were made by the MHRA and their inspection findings. Not having the right people at the table for risk assessment, and in not connecting risks over into plans, et cetera. So all of those sort of disconnected things, they're noticing when they go in. So hopefully these are observations that were from, you know, the early days, and we're learning from that as we move forward. Yeah, absolutely. We got a few more minutes before we want to look at some of the audience questions, and it looks like a number of questions have been entered, which is fantastic. But can I give you about 1 minute each to comment on this question? What do you see as the important emerging topics that yours and other consortia plan to or expect to focus on moving forward? In other words, what's still left to be done with RBQM? And maybe we've already touched on some of it with your comments already, but you know, what are your thoughts on that? And I guess, Nicole, why don't you start with that one?
Sure. So from an ACRO perspective, I think we want to continue to collaborate with regulators and get that interchange of feedback and information. I think that is still top priority for us, and make sure that there's clarity and understanding in all the new guidances that are coming out. I think we have seen more guidance in the last 2 years than we have seen in the previous 12 years probably put together. So I think that's great. I think we need to continue that collaboration with regulators so that we can fine-tune expectations. We don't ever want to go down a path again where we assume 100% SDR and SDV is what they want, so that's what we do. We need to make sure that we have a very clear understanding of what the expectations are versus what our flexibility is in being able to take these risk-based approaches. So I think the collaboration with regulators is still very important. And then I think, you know, automation and fine-tuning is going to need to be where we focus. We won't be done with an RBM solution, no matter which company you're in, for a number of years. We still need to perfect it, refine it, and once we've perfected and refined it, then we need to move into automating it, so that we can really maximize the efficiencies that we expect to achieve.
Excellent. Thanks, Nicole. Linda, your thoughts?
So one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, but is, to me, one of these, there are sort of two underlying emerging areas. One is, how do we apply RBQM to new operating models and new protocol designs? So, you know, Steve, you know, from some conversations we've been having that, you know, what happens when you have a basket trial? You know, what if you've got DCT components? Like, how do we oversee, manage, bring that into the RBQM environment? So I think those are areas that we still need to explore. The other, we've started to explore a little bit, but I see as a really important area, which is really differentiating between data being there, missing data, versus data that's reliable. And that's going to be, I think, a real emerging issue as we get more and more patient-reported outcome data, et cetera. We actually went back and updated our ECOA process metric toolkit this year, and paid more attention now to the training that patients are going through, et cetera, than we did 3 years ago when we had the metrics. So I think that whole area, I think we're getting to what's the important data we have to look at, but then the next thing is, what's behind that data that we know it's actually reliable and we can use it to make decisions.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. And you mentioned about decentralized trials and increasing like ACRO data and other types of, and Nicole, you mentioned, the extremely large volumes of data that we're starting to get in clinical trials and the average number of data points. In terms of risk detection and quality oversight, just to add to your earlier point, Nicole, about getting data in near real time or real time from the source systems is so critical. I guess I would add to that probably the audit trail data as well, the metadata, right? And you may have mentioned that before, because in terms of overseeing quality, I think we're all recognizing more and more it's not just an analysis of the actual data, which should be analyzed, but the audit trail data about how these systems are being used by patients and investigators can also reveal a lot about the reliability or potential reliability of the data. So just wanted to add that thought in. I want to move to some questions, and we should have time for at least a couple anyway before we wrap up. We have about 6 or 7 minutes left in our session today. So let me see. First question, let's see. We have one of the next progressions would seem to be applying RBQM principles to data cleaning performed by data management groups. Is this coming up at all in your working groups? Either of you have any comments on that one?
It hasn't come up specifically around the data management components, although if you think back historically on how we've cleaned data, I feel like in some ways we have taken a risk-based approach. So just as an example, when we do the old-fashioned listings reviews, we didn't do listings reviews on all the data, every kind of data point, et cetera, and we didn't write queries on everything we possibly could. So I feel like in some ways, data management has historically taken kind of a risk-based approach in what do we need listings reviews on? What do we need to build queries on in some of those kinds of things? Can we do a better job, a more focused job, a much more closely linked to our risk assessment than we have before? Absolutely. And I think we can continue to go down that path, but I think it's more of extending the way that data management has focused more, with more specific intent to link to those critical data, critical processes than we have before, but I think it's right along those lines. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense to me as well. And I think you both were just mentioning a little while ago, the principles of RBM are being applied across all different areas of the business, and data management is no exception to that. Linda, anything else you wanted to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly in the data management group talked about and put together some metrics that are looking at, missing critical data. So trying to move towards not all the data, as you mentioned, Nicole, but the critical data. I will say the piece we haven't, and that's often driven primarily with what's in the EDC. And I think the real challenge that we face and sort of how, where, and when in the industry we're going to tackle this is, we have a decreasing amount of data that's sitting in EDC. And, who, how, where, and when are we going to talk about, the quality of all the data coming in from wearables and, the ECOA, et cetera. And we have not kind of crossed that bridge. And not sure sort of where in the industry it's the best place to do that. And because we want to have as many organizations and the right people at the table when that discussion happens.
I couldn't agree more. And I think we've got to do it not only for our patients, because it's their data and it's their safety that we're looking at when those data sources are coming in from a lot of different places, but we need to look at it from the PI's position, because how these investigators, they don't even have access to all the data in one place. Like they can't go to a chart anymore and get the full story. We've got to do a better job, I think, as an industry in figuring out, especially from a DCT perspective, when we've got all these different sources of data, who's overseeing that patient and how are we making it simpler and easier for them to get the full picture so they can make the medical decisions that they need.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Time for maybe one more quick question to get your thoughts on. This is an interesting one. What are your thoughts on how to best engage PIs and sites in general in RBQM? What does successful engagement look like from an RBQM perspective? Nicole, any thoughts on that?
Awareness, I think, transparency. I think those kinds of things are definitely the areas that we can provide the best linkages.
Yep. No, that makes sense. Linda, how about you? Anything to add to that?
Well, I have an interesting observation. I am preparing for a panel session around site KRIs, what's being used and sort of why are we using them, and have been talking with some executive directors of site networks, and one is going to be on the panel. And when you say to them, what are people measuring about you and why, they're very fixated on contract time, IRB approval. They actually don't really have an understanding of what's going on to some extent with the KRIs and centralized monitoring. And they're very interested and curious to learn more. And it's just an indication that we're doing all this stuff and we're not really sharing helpful information with them in a way that they're understanding the whole framework of what's happening here. So I'm looking forward to that conversation at an event I'm going to be at in October.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Great point. All right, well, I think it's time to wrap up the session for today. I again want to thank both of you for sharing your perspective and your insights and the perspective of the industry working groups that you've been working with as well. It's been a fantastic discussion today, so really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience, too, for joining us and for all of your questions. We received a lot of questions today. We don't have time, obviously, to get to all of them. But any questions we didn't have a chance to address during the session, we'll gladly follow up with the individuals who asked them directly. If you'd like to request a recording of today's session, please reach out. You see the email there, contact@CluePoints.com. We also welcome you to join our next session of today. It's a panel discussion again on leveraging RBQM in new and exciting ways that you never envisioned. You can seamlessly transition to that session by clicking on the Take Action tool on your screen to join. So we'll see you there shortly. And thanks again, Linda and Nicole. It's been a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Take care.